and welcome to the 8th episode of our Lakes Chat Summer Series. I'm Jennifer Caddick, Vice President of Communications and Engagement here at the Alliance for the Great Lakes. And for today's episode, we're going to be talking about water levels. So for the past few years, each of the 5 Great Lakes has faced record or near record high water levels. Yet just about a decade ago, the lakes were experiencing a period of record or near record low water levels. And earlier this month, the New York Times published an interactive investigative report on the serious impact of Lake Michigan's high water levels on the city of Chicago. As the article details, much of this is linked to climate change. Our guest today is Joel Bremeyer, Alliance for the Great Lakes President and CEO, and we're talking water levels and climate change. Welcome, Joel. Thanks for joining us today.
Glad to be here, John.
So let's jump right in. The Great Lakes in general, they've always gone through these periods of high water and low water, and they sort of ebb and flow almost over decades, but things are changing. So tell us how the water level cycle on the Great Lakes are changing and what climate change has to do with all of this.
So water levels on the Great Lakes, as anybody who's lived here for a little bit knows, go up and down naturally. And so this variation of 5 to 6 feet, especially that you see on Lake Michigan and Huron from year to year or from decade to decade is normal. Water comes in mainly through rainfall and it goes out mainly through evaporation. And so what we're seeing, though, according to scientists that are watching climate change trends, is the impacts of increased precipitation and increased evaporation kind of competing with each other in the Great Lakes and making these level changes more extreme and happening faster than what we've seen in the past. And so we went from that record low within a few years up to a record high, which was very unusual, even though we're kind of still right within the boundaries of the records.
And so, I think sometimes some people think of water level fluctuations as just kind of an inconvenience, right? If water levels are really high, maybe your favorite beach isn't as available, it's a little bit smaller, or when the water levels are low, you might think, my friend who has a boat has some challenges with his marina slip trying to get in there. But the problems are actually pretty serious when you add it all up. And we saw some of that in that New York Times reporting by Dan Egan, who was a reporter, detailing some of those really serious consequences impacting specifically Chicago and the high water levels. But we know those low water levels also have caused some serious problems. So tell us about these impacts, both on people, on our cities, and on the Great Lakes regional economy.
The thing to keep in mind with the impacts of changing lake levels is that the Great Lakes are 1,000 miles wide, right? And so water levels affect different parts of the region differently, right? So when water levels are high in some parts, you have impacts like coastal erosion, potential property damage, and even in extreme cases, homes falling into the water. In a city like Chicago, where you've got apartment buildings right on the shoreline, you might have flooded basements and power outages because the water gets into these residential towers. And again, you have shoreline damage. In other parts of the Great Lakes, the impacts of low water levels might be keenly felt, right? You might have properties where the lake access actually goes hundreds and hundreds of feet away from the shoreline because the water level drops so much. And that's what happened during the record low water levels in the eastern part of the Great Lakes back in the 2010s and 2000s. You have impacts on shipping. So when the water levels are low, large freighters can't load as much cargo. You might have roads getting washed out at the coast when water levels are high, but these impacts vary across the region, and they vary. For some communities, low water is great. For some communities, low water is a disaster, and vice versa. So it's hard to have a one-size-fits-all kind of solution to managing water levels at the shoreline.
Yeah, and I think some of those economic impacts are things that we don't think about until you really add it up, right? So I'm here on Lake Ontario, where it flows into the St. Lawrence River, and this is a very tourism dependent community. So, those low and high water levels impact whether people can come use their cottages or get to places, but it also impacts shipping, right? If ships are carrying less stuff because water levels are so low, that has an economic impact, right? So those add up, big picture over time.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, you might say, well, a beach is gone for a season or two, and that's a relatively minor inconvenience. Those beaches do drive, in the cases of larger cities, millions of people to the shoreline every year. In smaller communities, that might be the revenue that a smaller town makes in 4 months of the year that carries them through the year for those tourism dollars, right? So that can be a real significant impact, regardless of the size of community that you're in.
Yeah. And so I know you and I get this question all the time, right? On variations, whether it's high or low water levels. But people ask, like, well, can't we just build some structures, right? If the water level's high, can't we just build something to like keep the lake out? Or can't we build some dams to hold the water back when water is low? We've had people ask us, when the water was high on Lake Michigan, can't we just pull the plug and drain it out down the Chicago River to the Mississippi? What's your response when people talk about those kinds of proposals and questions to deal with water levels, these sort of structural changes that people sometimes propose?
Well, the first thing I like to do is remind everybody that the lakes were here first and that they are alive, right? So we're living next to these living, incredible biological systems that sustain the fish and wildlife in them, but they also sustain people, as we've just been talking about with the economies that depend on the Great Lakes. These are living systems, and so the idea that we can manipulate them, perhaps pull the plug and send water down south or out west in times of high water, one that would be I would say deeply opposed by most people who live in the Great Lakes region to send our water to far-flung places, and we've actually done a lot of work to prevent that from happening. Or that we could somehow, wall off the shoreline so it's sort of like a bathtub that treats the lakes as this sort of sterile bucket full of water, which of course they're not. We don't want to do either one of those things, because what that means is you're actually manipulating the health and actually degrading the health of the lakes themselves, just for the sake of managing water when it's high one year and low the next. That's not a path we want to go down. And we've seen some of the impacts of water level manipulation in the Great Lakes, in most extremely on Lake Ontario, which is actually a lake that is managed for its water level at both ends. And not only have there been some significant conflicts about water level management, it's actually degraded the health of Lake Ontario over the years, in ways that are just now starting to be restored and corrected. And so that's not a path we want to go down. And we've seen the impacts again of like walling off the lake. Here where I live in Chicago, Illinois, we've actually probably hardened the shoreline the most over the longest distance here in Illinois. And while we've got a great public lakefront in Chicago, we've also got a lakefront that has been kind of sterilized and isn't as much part of that living Great Lake as it was several hundred years ago. So we've got to be really careful and considerate when we're thinking about how we manage the shoreline.
For sure. And so related to all this, but a slightly different angle, is some of the extreme storm events we've been seeing in the Great Lakes region. I think there was a ton of media coverage in late June when Detroit suffered a significant flooding event. Something like 6 inches of rain fell on the city in about 24 hours, which is a massive amount of water in a really short period of time. And those kinds of major heavy rainstorm events are connected to climate change. So what's going on there? What's the climate change connection? And why is that kind of an issue a concern for the Great Lakes and for our communities?
So, as I mentioned earlier, rainfall is one of the main determinants of whether lake levels go up or down from year to year, decade to decade. We have seen over the last several years extraordinary records being set and shattered for rainfall in the Great Lakes states. Like you just mentioned, the Detroit storm, where my father, who lives in Detroit, actually had water in his basement for the first time since he moved there in 1975, which tells you just how extraordinary of an event that was. You've seen similar in the New York Times story that you mentioned at the top of the discussion. There was the events of May 2020 in Chicago, where the water in the river got so high from combined sewage that there was actually concern of whether it could even be drained to the lake, which is the sort of the last resort for sewage overflows. And eventually that water did flood out parts of downtown Chicago. So you're seeing these major events 500-year storms, 1,000-year storms happening closer together than ever before. And this is all linked together, right? And so those storms, they don't just fill up the Great Lakes and cause more coastal damage. They're also flooding parts of cities, and especially they're flooding parts of cities where people may be least prepared and least able to afford the damage that they inflict, right? So you've got neighborhoods where basements are being flooded, or whole coastal areas are being eroded away, and it's really hitting people in the pocketbook, and it's affecting people's health because, of course, flood water isn't healthy water. And so you've seen these impacts all connect together, and we're starting to get a better idea of what it's going to take to actually sort of rebuild the Great Lakes region's water infrastructure in a way that recognizes that this is all connected, that climate's changing these systems, and actually invests, commensurate with what the need is in places where we've kind of been dragging our feet for too long.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point about some of the it's exacerbating infrastructure problems in our cities, right? With our old, cities like Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, et cetera, have really old sewer and water systems that are kind of a mess right now. And then when you add on these massive storms, it's making it even worse, the problems they're facing.
Yeah, absolutely. Cities aren't necessarily equipped to handle it, and smaller communities that may not have a huge tax base are being faced with big bills to protect their shoreline or to figure out what to do about all this water that's all of a sudden running off into their local river and polluting their local part of a Great Lake. It's a real knotty challenge, and one that a lot of communities aren't able to grapple with on their own.
Yeah. Sort of shifting back to some other climate change areas, the news this summer has been dominated by the climate change impacts that are being felt in the West and Southwest, right? The massive droughts, those extreme heat events that communities are suffering through, and of course the terrible wildfires. But when people talk about the Midwest, we kind of often talk about ourselves as down the line as potentially a climate refuge, right? If those areas, say in the West or Southwest, or maybe even the Southeast, become unlivable or very challenging places to live as we continue, if climate change continues unchecked, the idea is that people might start gravitating to the Great Lakes region because we have plenty of clean water, we have lots of space here. But at the same time, as we've been talking about, we have some serious problems here that are being impacted by climate change. So how do you respond to talk about the Great Lakes region as a climate refuge?
Well, number one, we are clearly at risk. Number two, we do have longer to prepare for the impacts than some other parts of the country. That only helps if we start that work now, right? And so when we think about the Great Lakes as a potential climate refuge, it's because, well, yeah, the water's getting warmer, the air is getting warmer, maybe the winters will become shorter. So what does that mean? Well, we could have longer growing seasons, right? You could potentially grow more food here in this breadbasket of the country. You could potentially have, nicer areas for tourism because it's a bit warmer, right? And people, and of course we have all this phenomenal water right in our backyards. And so people see that as a positive. What we got to remember, though, is that we've got toxic algae blooms that are actually fouling the drinking water supply for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people in any given year. We've got invasive species that actually are going to be more likely to be able to establish and thrive in the Great Lakes as the water conditions get warmer, right? It's not often thought about as a climate change impact. Of course, we've got all the coastal damage problems we've been talking about. We've got the flooding problems that we've been talking about that are affecting, again, in any given storm, hundreds of thousands of people in a particular place. So as a climate refuge, I think the Great Lakes, comes up a bit short right now. And so if we really want to fulfill or kind of, amplify that promise of our water, use that as a way to attract people and businesses to the Great Lakes region, which I think we should do. We have a lot of work to do to actually make this, a healthy place to live where people can thrive with healthy water. We can't just assume that because the water is here, it's going to, kind of make the region, attractive, for future generations. We've got a lot of work to do just to make it livable and healthy for those who are living here right now.
Well, certainly major issues that we'll keep talking a lot about, and certainly more to talk about in the future. But that's all the time that we have for today. Thank you so much, Joel, for joining us. Thank you again to our colleague, Michelle Farley, who you don't see on screen, but she's behind the scenes helping make all of this happen. We are taking a hiatus for the month of August so that we can all get out and enjoy the Great Lakes. And I hope that all of you who are tuning in are able to get out and enjoy the lakes. You're part of the Great Lakes too. Thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.